Hi, everybody. Welcome to Freedom Talk. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Simone Gold to the show. Dr. Gold probably needs no introduction, but I noticed she says doctor, lawyer, and warrior. I love that warrior part. Of course, you're the founder of America's Frontline Doctors, and you're leading a nationwide movement to drain the science swamp. So you've certainly done a lot of work there. And I know you wanted to talk about your recent article about California's misinformation law. It was recently published in the Epic Times and other locations. Can you tell us about what you're facing now with California?
Thank you so much. It's very tragic what's going on in California. AB 2098, which became law on January 1st, 2023, really punishes doctors if they have conversations, honest, authentic conversations with patients. And when they punish the doctors, of course, they downstream punish the patients because the doctors are not going to simply allow themselves to have their own livelihoods threatened. The doctors will simply go silent. So this was a quote unquote COVID misinformation bill, which attempts to silence doctors and other providers from giving their opinion based on their education and their experience from sharing that information with patients. The reason this is such an enormous problem is, first of all, there are constitutional rights that you don't give up simply because you're a licensed professional, right? So doctors don't have less constitutional right to speak freely than another person. Number two, if you're licensed in a particular state and you've taken many years to get your license, which of course implies a higher salary and customers and things like that, you're not going to threaten that just because of one particular situation. So you've now taken a whole class of people and you've decreased their ability to push back on any kind of government narrative. So while it's true they're doing this to doctors, what's to stop this from doing this to business owners? I mean, why not any licensed category? Number three, it's such a dangerous precedent on the foundational freedom of our nation, which is free speech. This is why it's currently under 3 different types of legal attack, which I outlined in the Epic Times yesterday. Mm-hmm. This is utterly critical. I don't care if you're left, right, up, down, center, sideways, it doesn't matter. I joined, shockingly enough, with the ACLU. The ACLU is very much against this bill. It's very scary stuff. It also blocks second opinions. I mean, if you go to a doctor just to get a second opinion, and the second opinion doctor doesn't agree with the government narrative, you're out of luck.
Yeah, absolutely. I worked as editor-in-chief for a medical publication when the pandemic first started. And I saw through a lot of this because I was doing the deep research. And I'm sort of, you might say, a doctor of the soil. I'm a soil scientist and conservation scientist. But you're right. I mean, this kind of suppression of speech, of professional opinions could go throughout many industries. And I think it's something that should be a concern to all of us. And you called it an Orwellian gag order. And it's absolutely diametrically opposed to the scientific method, which invites debate, which invites alternate opinions and following the evidence for our leads.
Right. So the critical thing that it's free speech, and the other critical part is that it's a licensed category. So what we saw in the period of lockdowns, especially in California, is businesses stayed closed. And even if they were sympathetic to not being closed, they were very afraid the government was going to pull their license to serve food, their license to cut hair, their license to serve alcohol, right? They were very afraid of losing their government license. It was their livelihood. So it's these two things. It's if you've got a fundamental right to speak freely, which you don't lose just because you're licensed. And two, if you're going to attack the free speech of any licensed category, right now, physicians, it could be any licensed category. Very dangerous stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was a business owner at the time, and long story, but I've been arrested twice. I know that you were arrested and spent some time in jail. And why was that? Why was it? Was it simply because you had an opinion?
Yes, I was an invited guest speaker at the Capitol on January 6th. From my perspective, it was simply another speaking engagement to which I was invited. There were actually about 20 people that were invited with me, a couple of incoming Congress people. That day, I presented myself to the designated location, and somehow mysteriously, all of the speakers were canceled on the spot right then and there. That's actually why I was at the east side of the Capitol doors. And then the whole day went not as planned, but I was swept in with the crowd, and I really started giving my speech. I mean, it happens to not have been about the election. It happens to have been about health freedom and constitutional right to, inalienable right to your body, et cetera. That is what I spoke about. There's tons of video of me doing that. Of course, there's no violence. I mean, I preach saving lives. Obviously, I would never be violent. And that was my experience of the day. However, as you know, the Department of Justice was incredibly politicized, the FBI, et cetera, and they set out to arrest any person who was there. And I got, swept into that. And much to my shock, the judge sentenced me to 60 days in a federal penitentiary and maximum security to boot.
Wow. Well, I'm sorry you went through that. I was recently sentenced to 70 with 30 set aside. We've appealed it, but I understand that kind of persecution and these kangaroo court trials. And obviously that was a setup, but, shifting gears a little bit, this bill talks about, quote, contemporary scientific consensus. And I just wanted to say, scientific consensus was Einstein's static universe, an eternal universe, and then they discovered the background radiation of the Big Bang and showed that there was a beginning of the universe. There was the medical war on dietary fat, which ended up causing, I think, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, that kind of thing. So I see a dangerous precedent here where you're not allowing prevalent theories to be challenged, which again is one of the basic premises of science and the scientific method.
Right. So there's a couple of things that you hit on. Exactly right. One is that science is always changing, always evolving, ever changing. And two, it was the suppression, because from my perspective, there was a ton. The vast majority of evidence showed that early treatment worked. For example, the vast majority of evidence showed that the shots would not work to stop transmission per Pfizer, per Moderna applications. It said right in there it wouldn't stop transmission. And if you give a shot like that in the middle of a respiratory viral pandemic, and it doesn't stop transmission, of course it's going to cause mutants and variations to come along. I mean, that's completely like basic science 101. So what is scientific consensus, and also what is published scientific consensus? You and other people didn't necessarily hear all of the science that I was hearing because I was searching it out. So it's such a dangerous precedent.
Yeah, it really is. And, the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, said all knowledge is provisional, conjectural, and hypothetical. And he talked about falsification. And the fact that science and medicine as a part of that has to be constantly challenging the narrative. And, I think essentially not allowing people to get a second opinion affects all of us. It's an injustice to everyone because we should have the right to go out and seek alternative treatment. Things like chiropractic and acupuncture are non-mainstream things. I'm sure got some resistance in the beginning, but now they've become more mainstream.
Yeah, in fact, and by the way, when the government puts its thumb on a scale of things like that, it really, really affects us downstream. For example, there was a huge lawsuit between allopathic, osteopathic physicians and chiropractic physicians. I think it was in the 70s, and it really forevermore changed the face of chiropractic care in this country. Very similar kind of problem decades earlier with naturopath doctors. These kinds of battles, which the government then put its thumb on, meant that medical care in America diverged very significantly from medical care in other nations, which didn't have this type of litigation and thumb on the scale by the government. And it's really limited the options for people, for wellness care, for natural herbs, for things that are very normal and natural across much of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's so great to have the freedom to make your own healthcare decisions. It's something that is part of the Bill of Rights. And I know you talked about some of the amendments. First of all, it's a natural right that I think would be covered by the 9th Amendment. But can you talk about the other amendments that this bill transgresses?
Oh, my goodness gracious. Of course, there's freedom of speech. It's a direct attack on freedom of speech. 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. Physicians should not be singled out as a particular class that no longer has its right to free speech. For me, those are the two most important: equal protection and freedom of speech. This is unbelievably serious. The reason America's Frontline Doctors is so aggressive on this is if we lose the ability to have free speech for a licensed category in a large state like California, we are going down a path of destruction for this nation that I don't think we'll ever recover from.
Yeah, and it's the whole idea that the government will decide what's best for us. It's not, one side always talks about attacks on democracy. It's not democratic to tell people you have one decision. I mean, recently we've been told that the Biden administration is trying to eliminate gas stoves. We don't need our lives micromanaged. And I literally had someone comment on a social media post once saying, "Don't you know that the government is here to protect us?"
Yeah.
Do you believe the government is here to protect us?
So I'm going to quote Ronald Reagan. He said, "You can't be both for big government and the little guy." Just keep that in mind. The government is not here to protect you. The government is here to serve its own interests, which means getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and keeping its funding going. Anytime you set up a committee or an agency, for example, it gets a budget, and then it wants to keep that budget going year after year, and it wants to expand that budget. And if it doesn't spend its budget, it then loses its budget. They're taking away our individual liberties, and we need to push back, especially on things like freedom of speech. Everything follows freedom of speech. We lost that during COVID. We weren't able to speak. It's a miracle that we're able to speak now on Twitter. And we hope that continues. We're doing a lot of Twitter spaces, for example, on COVID and all the disinformation that we're now revealing that the disinformation was on the other side. And I just want to share, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
One of the questions I've been asked a lot over the last year or two is, how can I find a doctor who won't lie to me? And that's what I've been working on for more than the last year. And we are going to bring that option to the American people, so you can find ethical doctors like America's Frontline Doctors. And it's called Gold Care, goldcare.com, where you can find a doctor who isn't going to lie to you, we are not bound by insurance companies or pharmaceutical companies or any other interest other than what's in your best interest. Goldcare.com.
Yeah, I saw that, and I'll put that up on the screen. And I was blown away, to be honest, looking at your websites, both of them, at how many things you're involved in, how many services you're offering to the American people. I love that. It's wonderful. It is what this country is built upon: innovation, rolling up your sleeves, citizens getting involved. And I think this bill that you wrote about is going exactly in the opposite direction, saying, look, we're going to tell you what's right and wrong. We're going to tell you what you need to do. And again, it is a very dangerous precedent. And I wanted to bring up something. I had just put up this quote in my list of quotes. It's a great one by Benjamin Rush. And he said, unless we put medical freedom into the Constitution, the time will come when medicine will organize into an undercover dictatorship to restrict the art of healing to one class of men and deny equal privileges to others. The Constitution of this republic should make special privilege for medical freedom as well as religious freedom. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Oh my gosh, that is one of the most prescient quotes of all time. So medical tyranny is a very easy way for tyrants to usher in tyranny and fascism amongst their people. This is not new. This is a very tried and true tactic, because fear is the easiest way to captivate and control people. So for example, in the French Revolution, there was a committee on public safety during Robespierre's reign of terror. This is how they kind of corralled people into doing things that they wouldn't otherwise do. So would people normally have closed their shops, closed their businesses, not send their kids to school, put a piece of paper over their face? Nobody would have done such things. They wouldn't have complied with the government, even if the government required them to, except that they themselves are captured by fear. The best way to make people frightened is through a lack of information on the medical area. It's much more effective than economic or religious tyranny, for example. It's much more rapid. So we need to have free speech, especially around medical areas, so that we don't allow the population to become consumed with fear based upon propaganda. It's critical.
On May 7th, Child Protective Services showed up at my home. They questioned my husband and I. They questioned my child without me present.
My son's death was a result of a criminal with an evil heart and a justice system failing to hold him accountable for the laws he had already broken.
My family has been submitted to threats because of you, death threats on my staff. You are violating my civil rights.
You are resisting.
I'm not resisting. I'm just strong.
That's something I've emphasized quite a bit on my show, is that to get our freedoms back, we have to have individual courage. We have to have courage as communities. And you're right that they want to produce fear. And a lot of people probably don't realize that the Nazis got the Jews into the Warsaw Ghetto under the pretext of, well, we're protecting you from typhus. And we know that that regime had quite a bit of medical tyranny. So I think you raise a really good point. How much of this do you think is driven by big pharma and their interests?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm asked that question a lot. This might sound a little bit naive. I do think pharma has some nefarious intent, but I think their main intent is to make money. I think there's other people who have more evil intent, but I think we could ally with Big Pharma if they were properly incentivized. Now, it may not be possible anymore because they've got so much power. Big Pharma, in my opinion, has more power than the federal government, for example. But it is possible to harness the good that Big Pharma can do if there were laws that didn't advantage them from cheating and stealing, quite frankly. I'm sure you know the 1986 bill that gave vaccine manufacturers immunity, shielded them from any liability, may have had a good intent. It's hard to bring vaccines or good, effective vaccines to market unless you shield the manufacturer from liability. But that was the bad business approach, because here we are 40 years later, paying the price for having shielded manufacturers from the harms of the goods that they've created. So that was a terrible approach. But I have a fantasy where, we could work with Big Pharma so they could make money and they could make good products, but it's not so incentivized to be only about money. I do think that our Congress has created the mess that Big Pharma has turned into. I'm old enough and my father is a doctor. I'm old enough to remember when I did think that pharmaceutical companies were excellent. They came up with amazing life-saving drugs. And so I know that it's possible, but I don't know if we have the political will in this country to get there. I just want to add, in the meanwhile, doctors like myself are really expanding our knowledge base on natural solutions, naturopathic solutions. Most drugs all drugs originally originated from something natural in the environment. And so we're going kind of back to the roots and investigating that. And again, at Gold Care, we're actually partnering with naturopathic doctors and allopathic doctors to bring you natural solutions.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that's where our fields overlap, because I studied a lot the soil microbiology, and a lot of medicines have come from microbiology. One of the more well-known examples is penicillin coming from a fungus. An analogous example is how the big fertilizer companies, the petrochemical companies, fund universities. And it's not that they're bad. I haven't been against using these items strategically, but for quite some time, they really suppressed the idea of organic farming or alternative farming. And I'm glad to say that's taken more of a foothold, to the point where we're kind of in the opposite direction. And I wrote a piece for the Epic Times on how the World Economic Forum is trying to ban synthetic fertilizers now. So we seem to have this pendulum swing. But if alternative medicine is getting more attention, I think that's good. I think it gives more people power to treat themselves in their homes, power to prevent illness. What do you think about that?
100%. First of all, America's Frontline Doctors, Dr. Gold, we're just in favor of freedom. And part of freedom is having informed choices, so you know how to even think about an issue. And at the end of the day, you get to decide. There's so much disinformation, misinformation. And really, that was my role, was to bring you the information, and then you can decide for yourself. I think most people and most institutions don't set out to be nefarious and have evil intent. So I think you could align them to do better in the public interest. One really specific example I was thinking as you were speaking is, if we could do one thing that would change things tomorrow, it would be to remove pharmaceutical advertising from the airwaves. Again, I'm old enough to remember, and because my father is a physician, I think it was in the 1980s when all of a sudden you were allowed to start putting pharmaceutical ads on the TVs. Back then, of course, there was no internet. And I remember my father saying that it was absolutely going to ruin medicine. And I'm a child, and I'm like, okay, but I didn't really understand it. Now I understand. I think 60 or 65% of ads on television now are from pharmaceuticals.
Wow.
Which, even if they're accurate, they're going to be the shows and the executives are going to have to do pharma's bidding. That needs to stop.
Yeah. And, like I told my wife, because she's seen what's happening, and I think it's driven her more away from traditional medicine. Traditional Western medicine obviously has done amazing things, and we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I do see a contradiction in what you just said. Now we're being encouraged to ask our doctor about certain medications, and yet on the other side of it, we're being discouraged from asking about maybe alternative treatments, hydrochloroquine, ivermectin. Partially, I think it's driven by money. Partially, I think there are more nefarious interests there. But I can't agree with you more. Big Pharma does a lot of good. I think sometimes there are people who are wanting to make a lot of money. I think sometimes maybe some bad actors like China are involved in
China,
that.
yeah, no, China is a huge problem. I mean, China, so you probably know this, but most of your viewers probably don't know that China essentially controls our supply chain entirely when it comes to medications. I learned this over the last 3 years. I didn't know that. So not only pharmaceuticals, but over-the-counter medications like Tylenol, we simply don't manufacture these things anymore. We could, but right now, this minute, we are vulnerable. If China and America got into it, we're vulnerable to China turning off the spigot and our ability to access life-saving medications that people really do need. This is a huge problem for America.
It certainly is. And you don't even have to dig that deep to understand that China has had a 100-year plan to take down the United States. Xi Jinping would really very much like to be the sole superpower, I mean, over the entire globe. So it does seem to me like that's a precarious position if they're controlling our medicine. And that makes me think of a couple things. One is we need to bring manufacturing here.
Yes.
And number two, this, I think, highlights the importance of alternative methods. I'm a plant nerd. I'm a fan. I study medicinal plants, edible plants, that kind of thing. But I'm all for doing everything that you can to keep yourself healthy. You know, not necessarily taking your kids to the doctor every time they have a sniffle.
Exactly.
And you know, I don't know exactly what to think about this, but my parents, their philosophy was, you know, as long as it doesn't get too high, let him have the fever. Let his body fight it. You know, and back in the day, you know, expose the kids to chicken pox so they get it out of the way.
Yeah, may I just jump in? You share a couple of really important real world examples. Number one, fever is your body's way of revving up its immune system so it can fight the infection. I lost track of how many times I tried to educate nurses and doctors on this subject. This is well known. We know this. Nonetheless, it's everyone feels like they have to treat a fever. A fever is nature's way of helping you heal, get well quickly. Chickenpox is a very interesting example. So I've got 2 children and teenagers, and I really didn't want them to get the chickenpox shot because I was like, just go get chickenpox. But I had that option. These days, there really isn't really any chickenpox around for kids to get because they're all getting the shot, which raises a really interesting question. You know, maybe you should take the shot because you can't even get exposed to it anymore naturally. It's really a problem. Like, we doctors are causing a lot of problems because it's much better to be exposed to the natural virus than to get the shot. The shot, at best, a shot approaches or approximates the natural. It never exceeds it. That was another lie that Fauci used to pretend, is that there's nothing that will ever exceed natural immunity. So chickenpox we're really in a bit of a pickle.
Right. And I thought this was such a blatant falsehood because
it was
the traditional idea of a vaccine is, say, with smallpox, you inoculate yourself with the cowpox or dead viruses. There are different ways that it's done, but the whole purpose is to stimulate your immune system. The whole purpose is to stimulate your body's defenses and get them working. Now, I don't think we have vaccines as much as treatments, like proxies for your immune system. Correct. And I think of it like, you know, if I go to the gym and lift weights, I'm going to get stronger. But if somebody lifts them for me, I'm going to atrophy. Is that a good analogy for the immune system?
Actually, I think it is. You know, I saw some trash TV like 5 years ago, and it was so strange about people getting crazy plastic surgery where they would have like bicep implants put in, and it was so bizarre because they kind of looked like they were buff, but then you realize it was an implant in the arm, and it was funny because there was no strength in the arm. It's just like the appearance of the bicep. That's what it reminds me of to some extent. I think your analogy is pretty much on point. Is one, if you get the virus and you get sick, or even if you get mildly sick, like subclinically sick, your body builds up the immunity to it, and then for the rest of your life, in most cases, or certainly for many, many years, decades, in most cases, you're immune. So what does that mean? That means when you get exposed to it again, your body revs up those fighting soldiers, sends them out, and you do fine. And that's really how the system is designed to work. And now we're shortchanging that, and we're not letting people get exposed to these viruses. And I am sure that over the next decades, there'll be enough research that will show that many diseases that we're not even thinking of as infectious, but are actually being affected by not letting people have exposures. What I'm thinking of is children are now so shielded from just normal, exposure to dirt and playing and kept in as more sterile environments than they should be kept in. And I am certain we're going to discover over the years that this has affected their immune system or their growth or something. It's really not healthy to be kind of kept in this near bubble-like existence with hand sanitizer everywhere and don't get exposed to anything. It's really not healthy for us humans.
Yeah, kids need to get out in the soil.
That's
Of
right.
all the Peanuts characters, maybe Pigpen was the healthiest because he had that biological layer on his body. But we are training our kids to be separated from nature, to sit indoors, to play on video games. I saw an article that just came out encouraging kids who are overweight to get, I don't know, liposuction or surgery or something. I think Ian Smith, he's on the Reawaken Terror too. He posted, no way, get kids outside. I was trying to find a way to say that without 4-letter words. Ian's a New Jersey guy, but I completely agree with that that line of thinking.
Yeah, the short answer is just to do as close as nature intended. Go outside every day, get some sunshine, move your body every single day. It's good for your mind and it's good for your body. Eat all foods in moderation and try to make most of the foods that you're eating as close to natural as possible. Fruits and vegetables, meat, grains, but not, it's difficult. All the grains in the store that are sold as processed bread is not really what God intended. Just as close as you can to the natural, as close as you can to what your grandparents or your great-grandparents would have done.
Yeah, it's amazing to me because humanity has, you might say, co-evolved with pathogens for thousands of years, survived it. It really is, in a way, survival of the fittest. So COVID came along and mainly really seriously affected people who already had serious conditions, who were advanced in age. And, at the time that this came out, I was working with one of the nation's top doctors. He's known as Boston's top doctor, and was getting information straight out of China because he came over as an exchange student from China. But for me, it was just simply scientific information and looking at this and looking at, seeing where the evidence leads. But I was so surprised when I started getting this social backlash. And I mean, it got really personal and really insulting. You've probably experienced that more than anyone on the planet.
Right. So this really had nothing to do with the virus. The virus was not a serious threat in the scheme of human history. I don't want to be misquoted. It was a virus. It was real. I took care of COVID patients. I intubated COVID patients. I absolutely worked with COVID patients 100%. It's a real thing. However, in the scheme of human history, this was not a serious threat. We know that because when you look at the average age of death, it actually exceeded the life expectancy of people. So it really could do you in if you were frail or elderly. And by the way, most elderly did just fine as well. So it's usually that comorbid condition, the diabetes or dialysis, high sugar, obesity was huge. We made so much of this politically that people couldn't see straight. And people are acting as though it's the virus. It's not the virus. It's the underlying condition of the person getting the virus. That was one of the big lies that was perpetrated on all of humanity, is talking about the cause of this as the germ. The cause was the underlying condition and health of the person who got the germ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is something we discussed in I got cancel cultured out of that job because I didn't have the right politics. But we talked about how SARS-CoV-1 had about, I seem to recall, about a 10% mortality rate, and MERS was higher at 30%. But we also discussed how the more virulent or dangerous viruses tend to burn out pretty quickly, and then to survive, because they don't want to kill off all their hosts, they'll get spread more easily, but less dangerous. And COVID, we knew from the beginning, was going to come in relatively low compared to those. And in the early days, Dr. Fang said, we're most likely going to see very little mortality. We're going to see some people get it seriously, and a very small percentage will die from this. It will mainly be the elderly and those with comorbidities. And that's held true throughout the whole thing. And yet this virus is treated like it's the worst thing that's ever come along.
Right. And it also reveals the lie, because we knew immediately, and when I say immediately, by February of 2020, yours truly, and I wasn't the only one, I wasn't a bench scientist, I was just a bedside physician. We knew it wasn't affecting children. You could see from the data in China, it wasn't affecting children. We had to sort out the reasons why, ACE receptors, healthy underlying condition, whatever, but we knew it really wasn't affecting children. So the why in the world were we changing children's lives, for example? So once you've done that, you've revealed that this isn't about public health. It isn't about science. I should say maybe it was about public health, what I used to call the religion of public health. It was about bowing to the religion of public health. It certainly wasn't about science. It wasn't about a virus. That much is evidence and clear. And the only thing I'm kind of grateful for is that my goal for myself was to throw enough sand in the gear that we would stop vaccine mandates. I knew that this was always about something else. And I'm sorry for the people that got sick. And it really was millions of people that contacted America's Frontline Doctors. And we did everything we could to help these people. But my main goal is to make sure the vaccine passports, like social credit score system, like we have in China, that China has, didn't become the law of the land. So we filed numerous lawsuits. I think we ended up filing about 12 lawsuits against various bad actors, CDC, NIH, Department of Defense, various universities. And we just wanted to slow the vaccine mandate issue, because we knew if we slowed it, the facts would reveal themselves. How did we know? If you looked at the application from Pfizer and Moderna that they submitted to the FDA, it says in black and white that it doesn't stop the transmission. We also knew that the spike proteins cause clots, and we knew that they cross the blood-brain barrier. So I knew that if we just slowed the process enough, the facts would reveal themselves and the shots would kind of implode. That's exactly what we're seeing now. So many people have seen or know a person who something bad has happened, that there's no ability to silence this propaganda, and there's no ability to silence the truth anymore, because people have experienced it in their own life.
Yeah, and it's fear and hysteria with a lot of people, and there's so many things I could say. I mean, unpacking what you just said, it's so very rich. And you bring up the word mandates, or you might say orders. I don't see this anywhere in our founding documents. In fact, the founders, when they were meeting, to write the Declaration of Independence, there was a smallpox.
That's correct.
There was, I don't know, maybe it was typhus or something. They met together anyway. And I don't think Benjamin Franklin was at the door saying, do you have your mask?
That's a really, really good point, Kelly, because the founding fathers were very familiar with pandemics, and they met anyway, and they had constitutional conventions anyway. And there was a smallpox epidemic, I think about 2 decades before they did the signing of the Constitution, and it would never have held anybody back. No.
And I think they figured that disease was a part of life. They did what they could to prevent them, but there were more important things. And one of those, case in point, is that we've known for a long time that this virus, that influenza is more dangerous to children than this virus. And yet we deprive kids of 3 years of quality education. And I blew the whistle, and I got a lot of governmental persecution for saying, look, we're sending kids home. We're quarantining them. We're telling kids who maybe even can't medically tolerate a mask for different reasons that they have to go home. So we created these 2 classes of society, and we had kids committing suicide. We have a very documented, even in the mainstream media now, mental health crisis produced by these lockdown strategies.
Right. So this is a huge issue. It's really the same fight. It's a freedom fight. So my particular specialty is health. However, America's Frontline Doctors, we're in the freedom business. So it's a very important question you ask about the educational situation. We saw that the schools and the teachers' unions clearly did not put children first. If they put children first, they would have kept them in school, let them play sports, let them get together. They did none of that. It's abundantly clear. Kids should not be wearing masks, all that stuff. So we help you on America's Frontline Doctors to learn how to exit the school system. I've got 2 children. They went through the public school system. I had no axe to grind, essentially, in this area. But after what I've seen, it is. I mean, you should not leave your children in the public school system. I implore you as a mom, don't do it. They are, especially in states like California, but really in all the states across the board, they're doing lots of teaching of subjects that you would never teach your children. Yeah. They're teaching a lot of hate for our nation. They're teaching a lot of things on sexual immorality that don't benefit your child. Maybe your child can make those decisions for themselves when they're, 20 years old, but they don't need to be hearing about these things when they're 10 years old. And for example, they're allowing the state through the teachers to stand in for the parents and give consent, for example, to medical procedures, not just shots, but again, like transgender surgery and hormone blockers and things like that. I implore you as a mom to exit the public school system.
Yeah, as a father of five, I agree. And this is another topic, but our Arizona Bill of Parental Rights was trampled
Yes.
all over. But Dr. Gold, thank you so much for your time today. I know you have other interviews and things to get to. Thank you so much for fighting the good fight for truth and scientific objectivity. Do you want to tell people where they can contact you for more information and how we can support Frontline Doctors?
Thank you so much. There's two pieces of data of like URLs that you need to know about. America's Frontline Doctors, which is AFLDS.org, has so much information, as you pointed out, just so much information, free educational content. If you want to go to your school board meeting and you want to know what to say, or a city council meeting and you want to know what to say, medical information, we have a news division, we've got videos. It's fantastic, AFLDS.org. And please also check out goldcare.com, goldcare.com. We find you ethical doctors like myself. We show you how to leave the medical Marxist nation behind and come find doctors that are ethical, honorable, that'll put you first.
Well, Dr. Gold, Freedom Talk, one of our purposes here is to get people to think again and to see through the propaganda and get people really thinking for themselves. So thank you for leading that charge. I hope we can have you back again. We're here to back you up and support you, and we wish you all the best with your fight against this terrible bill that's been passed in California. Thank you so much for taking the time, Dr. Gold.
Thank you so much for having me.